It's summertime. That means snow cones, box office hits, and embarrassing camp crushes. But 50 years ago in the United States, it also meant voting rights. It was called Freedom Summer, and it was a critical moment for the civil rights movement. Young activists, both black and white, from the North and South, went to Mississippi to help register black voters. At the time, even though blacks made up half the state's population, only 6% were registered to vote. Not by choice. Remember, we're talking about the South under Jim Crow, a system of so-called separate but equal laws that segregated blacks and whites. It was also a time when white supremacists went around wearing bed sheets, intimidating and brutalizing blacks. When it came to voting, blacks faced all kinds of threats, physical and economic. Things like, if you vote, you're going to lose your job. Then you had things like poll taxes and literacy tests, which made it even harder to vote. Despite being violently attacked, Freedom Summer was effective. A year later, President Lyndon Johnson passed the Voting Rights Act. It banned these tests and taxes and also made sure that states in the Jim Crow South couldn't change their voting laws without getting it approved by the federal government. So why now, 50 years later, is it still so hard to vote in the US? Well, that's kind of by design. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 saw a historic number of young, low-income black and Latino voter turnout. That didn't sit well with Obama's political opponents. Since 2010, 22 states, many of them Republican-led, have been tightening their voting laws, making it more difficult for these communities to vote. For some of these states, it was a direct challenge to the Voting Rights Act. So how are they doing it? By passing voter ID laws. If you don't have government-issued photo identification, you can't vote. Though it might seem reasonable, according to the ACLU, 21 million Americans don't have photo ID. More often than not, they are low-income, elderly, and people of color. Some states are going a step further and requiring voters to show proof of citizenship. In Arizona and Kansas, tens of thousands of eligible voters haven't been able to register to vote in recent elections because of these citizenship laws. Then, in 35 states, if you've been convicted of a serious crime, sometimes even a non-violent one, you lose your voting rights. Right now, there are nearly 6 million former prisoners who can't vote. States have also straight up purged voters from lists without telling them. It's usually by accident when someone's name is similar to that of, say, a former felon, but millions of eligible voters have been wrongfully taken off lists and turned away at polls. Finally, things like restricting voter registration drives, moving polling stations, too few voting machines, limiting the number of hours polls are open, and getting rid of early voting have all made it tougher to cast ballots. But last June, voting rights took its biggest hit yet. The Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, ruling that regulating voting laws in former Jim Crow states is unconstitutional. Within hours of the decision, states scrambled to tighten their laws. North Carolina passed some of the most restrictive ones in the country, even cutting a program encouraging young people to vote. State legislators claim that these new requirements prevent voter fraud. Nevertheless, some of these laws are being challenged in courts and in the streets, but most of them are sticking. At midterm elections in November, half of Americans will find it harder to vote. So what do you think? Does the US need another Freedom Summer?